Harry froze, with a brass telescope in one hand and a pair of trainers in the other. He had completely forgotten to warn the Dursleys that Dumbledore might be coming. Feeling both panicky and close to laughter, he climbed over his trunk and wrenched open his bedroom door in time to hear a deep voice say, "Good evening. You must be Mr. Dursley. I dare say Harry has told you I would be coming for him." Harry ran down the stairs 2 at a time, coming to an abrupt halt several steps from the bottom, as long experience had taught him to remain out of arm's reach of his uncle whenever possible. There in the doorway stood a tall, thin man with waist-length silver hair and a beard. Half-moon spectacles were perched on his crooked nose, and he was wearing a long black traveling cloak and a pointed hat. Vernon Dursley, whose mustache was quite as bushy as Dumbledore's, though black, and who was wearing a puce dressing gown, was staring at the visitor as though he could not believe his tiny eyes. "Judging by the look of stunned belief, Harry did not warn you that I was coming," said Dumbledore pleasantly. "However, let us assure you that you have invited me warmly into your house. It is unwise to linger over long on doorsteps in these troubled times." He stepped smartly over the threshold and closed the front door behind him. "It is a long time since my last visit," said Dumbledore, peering down his crooked nose at Uncle Vernon. "I must say, your agapanthus are flourishing." Vernon Dursley said nothing at all. Harry did not doubt that speech would not return to him, and soon. The vein pulsing in his uncle's temple was reaching danger point, but something about Dumbledore seemed to have robbed him temporarily of breath. It might have been the blatant wizardishness of his appearance, but it might, too, have been that Uncle Vernon could sense that here was a man whom it would be very difficult to bully. "Ah, good evening, Harry," said Dumbledore, looking up at him through his half-moon glasses with a most satisfied expression. "Excellent, excellent." These words seemed to rouse Uncle Vernon. It was clear that as far as he was concerned, any man who could look at Harry and say "excellent" was a man with whom he could not see eye to eye. "I don't mean to be rude," he began, in a tone that threatened rudeness in every syllable. "Yet, sadly, accidental rudeness occurs alarmingly often," Dumbledore finished the sentence gravely. "Best to say nothing at all, my dear man. Ah, and this must be Petunia." The kitchen door had opened, and there stood Harry's aunt, wearing rubber gloves and a housecoat over her nightdress, clearly halfway through her usual pre-bedtime wipe-down of all the kitchen surfaces. Her rather horsey face registered nothing but shock. "Albus Dumbledore," said Dumbledore, when Uncle Vernon failed to effect an introduction. "We have corresponded, of course." Harry thought it an odd way of reminding Aunt Petunia that he had once sent her an exploding letter, but Aunt Petunia did not challenge the term. "And this must be your son, Dudley." Dudley had at that moment peered around the living-room door. His large blond head, rising out of the stripy collar of his pajamas, looked oddly disembodied, his mouth gaping in astonishment and fear. Dumbledore waited a moment or two, apparently to see whether any of the Dursleys were going to say anything, but as the silence stretched on, he smiled. "Shall we assume that you have invited me into your sitting-room?" Dudley scrambled out of the way just as Dumbledore passed him. Harry, still clutching the telescope and trainers, jumped the last few stairs and followed Dumbledore, who had settled himself in the armchair nearest the fire and was taking in the surroundings with an expression of benign interest. He looked quite extraordinarily out of place. Aren't we leaving, sir?" Harry asked anxiously. "Yes, indeed we are, but there are a few matters we need to discuss first," said Dumbledore, "and I would prefer not to do so in the open. We shall trespass upon your aunt and uncle's hospitality only a little longer." "You will you?" Vernon Dursley had entered the room, Petunia at his shoulder, and Dudley skulking behind them both. "Yes," said Dumbledore simply, "I shall." He drew his wand so rapidly that Harry barely saw it. With a casual flick, the sofa zoomed forward and knocked the knees out from under all 3 of the Dursleys so that they collapsed upon it in a heap. Another flick of his wand, and the sofa zoomed back into its original position. "We may as well be comfortable," said Dumbledore pleasantly. As he placed his wand in his pocket, Harry saw that his hand was blackened and shriveled. It looked as though his flesh had been burned away. "Sir, what happened to your—" "Later, Harry," said Dumbledore. "Please sit down." Harry looked at the remaining armchair. choosing not to look at the Dursleys, who seemed stunned into silence. "I would assume that you were going to offer me refreshment," Dumbledore said to Uncle Vernon, "but the evidence so far suggests that that would be optimistic to the point of foolishness." A third twitch of the wand, and a dusty bottle and 5 glasses appeared in midair. The bottle tipped and poured a generous measure of honey-colored liquid into each of the glasses, which then floated to each person in the room. "Madame Rosemerte's finest oak-matured mead," said Dumbledore, raising his glass to Harry. Hugh caught hold of his own and sipped. He had never tasted anything like it before, but enjoyed it immensely. The Dursleys, after quick, scared looks at one another, tried to ignore their glasses completely, a difficult feat as they were nudging them gently on the sides of their heads. Harry could not suppress the suspicion that Dumbledore was rather enjoying himself. "Well, Harry," said Dumbledore, turning toward him, "a difficulty has arisen in which I hope you will be able to solve for us. By us, I mean the Order of the Phoenix. But first of all, I must tell you that Sirius's will was discovered a week ago, and that he left everything he owned, that he left you everything he owned." Over on the sofa, Uncle Vernon's head turned, but Harry did not look at him, nor could he think of anything to say except, "Oh, right." "This is, in the main, fairly straightforward," Dumbledore went on. "You add a reasonable amount of gold to your account in Gringotts, and you inherit all of Sirius's personal possessions. The slightly problematic part is the legacy." His godfather's dead?" said Uncle Vernon loudly from the sofa. Dumbledore and Harry both turned and looked at him. The glass of mead was now knocking quite insistently on the side of Vernon's head. He attempted to beat it away. "He's dead? His godfather?" "Yes," said Dumbledore. He did not ask Harry why he had not confided in the Dursleys. "Our problem," he continued to Harry, as if there had been no interruption, "is that Sirius also left you number 12, Grimmauld Place." "He's been left a house?" said Uncle Vernon greedily, in his small eyes narrowing, but nobody answered him. "You can keep using it as headquarters," said Harry. "I don't care. You can have it. I really don't want it." Harry never wanted to set foot in number 12, Grimmauld Place again, if he could help it. He thought it would be haunted forever by the memory of Sirius prowling in the dark, musty rooms alone, imprisoned within the place he wanted so desperately to leave. "That is generous," said Dumbledore. "We have, however, vacated the building temporarily." "Why?" "Well," said Dumbledore, ignoring the mutterings of Uncle Vernon, who was now being rapped smartly over the head by the persistent glass of mead, "Black family tradition decreed that the house was handed down the direct line to the next male with the name of Black. Sirius was the last of the line, as his younger brother Regulus predeceased him, and both were childless. While his will makes it perfectly plain that he wants you to have the house, it is nevertheless possible that some spell or enchantment has been set upon the place to ensure that it cannot be owned by anyone other than a pureblood." A vivid image of the shrieking, spitting portrait of Sirius's mother that hung in the wall of number 12, Grimmauld Place, flashed into Harry's mind. "I bet there has," he said. "Quite," said Dumbledore. "And if such an enchantment exists, then the ownership of the house would most likely pass to the eldest of Sirius's living relatives, which would mean his cousin, Bellatrix Lestrange." Without realizing what he was doing, Harry sprang to his feet. The telescope and trainers in his lap rolled to the floor. Bellatrix Lestrange, Sirius's killer, inherit his house? "No," he said. "Well, obviously we would prefer that she didn't get it either," said Dumbledore calmly. "The situation is fraught with complications. We do not know whether the enchantments we ourselves have placed upon it, for example, making it unplottable, will hold now that the ownership has passed from Sirius's hands. It might be that Bellatrix will arrive on the doorstep at any moment. Naturally, we had to move out until such a time as we have clarified the position." "But how are you going to find out if I'm allowed to own it?" "Fortunately," said Dumbledore, "there is a simple test." He placed his empty glass on a small table beside his chair, but before he could do anything else, Uncle Vernon shouted, "Will you get these ruddy things off us?" Harry looked around. All 3 of the Dursleys were cowering with their arms over their heads as the glasses bounced up and down on their skulls, their contents flying everywhere. "Oh, I'm sorry," said Dumbledore politely, and he raised his wand again. All 3 glasses vanished. "But it would have been better manners to drink it, you know."